Hi, this is Ren,
This is Casey.
and this is All Walks of Film. So, we both saw Dunkirk, and we both came out with dramatically different experiences.
Yeah, I think we're understanding why the reviews kind of come down 50-50, either for or against the movie.
Yeah, and while Rotten Tomatoes has like a weird algorithm that usually favors movies like this and pushes them forward, I think that, at least for this movie, the reviews are actually much more split than what people's interpretation of Rotten Tomatoes would say it is. I think Rotten Tomatoes is a terrible site to actually gauge the quality of a film. It's just, what does the general consensus say for a film? And if that works for you, then, Rotten Tomatoes is a good site for you. If you're somebody like me or Casey, Rotten Tomatoes isn't usually like a very good gauge of like the quality of a film.
I will say, this seems to be more of a movie you're either gonna like or not like, not a movie that you're gonna think is good or bad. Because it's a good film, obviously. Like, I want to start off by saying it's not that I think it's a bad film.
Yeah. So starting off, we're really late in seeing this. I'm actually surprised it's still in the theater. Granted, Wonder Woman stayed in the theater, still is in the theater.
Too damn long!
But I was really shocked that this movie was still in the theater, still making reasonable box office and all that kind of stuff. And after Interstellar, I kind of grew out of love of Christopher Nolan. I do think that for the most part, he still is a director that people cherish a little too much, a little more than he deserves. And so I was really not looking forward to seeing this movie. I knew I had to see it because it's a war film and it was going to be up for awards. Like, this movie absolutely is going to be up for awards.
And to be fair, the past couple war films I've seen that have been up for awards have been fucking awful. Hacksaw Ridge and Bridge of Spies. Hacksaw Ridge has some good points and some really unforgivable points, whereas Bridge of Spies is just bland and boring and...
Yeah, so I went in with very low expectations for this film, just because, like, I have kind of been conditioned to think this way whenever reviews are super hyped for something. I don't know. I'm not primed to hate it. I just, know that my opinion is very different. So I was very shocked when I actually watched the film and was blown away by it, actually.
Despite the runtime and the PG-13 rating?
Well, it is actually a really short movie.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Yeah. I will say that, like, there are certain elements of this movie that, given the fact that its runtime is what it is, you could have maybe fleshed out a little bit more, padded a little bit more, and maybe a director's cut will be on its way in the future. But the film that we got was very strong and tense. I will say that, just so that you know, I am going into the film with a bit of a bias. I was in the military myself for 5.5 years. I was on board a destroyer and a minesweeper. Both ships I saw get sunk in this film. So that is something that's going to hit a lot closer to me than other people. Also, recently, there have been tragedies that have been happening in the Navy, of accidents that have happened that have also hit close to home, because it's in areas that I used to sail, as well as ships that I used to hang out with people that were on board. Now, granted, I don't think that I knew anybody that was on board now. Don't know that for certain, but I do know the circumstances that have led to that. Going back to the film, seeing some of the events that were put into the film. Now, given the fact that I was in the Navy and not, involved in any, Army stuff, like, you might think that there's a disconnect there, but the fact that much of the horror in the film happened at sea, on the shore, very close to the sea, and all the fear of drowning and all that kind of stuff. Like, all these fears were fears that I faced while I was out at sea. Sometimes it would be rational, other times it would be irrational. Maybe not irrational, but something that you have to be aware of when you're on a ship outside at sea. So, getting into the film, it starts off with a character named Tommy. Pretty much the only reason why I know his name is Tommy is because the credits told me so. This movie doesn't do a really good job of introducing you to characters as people. And what I mean is nobody's like really fleshed out in the film. I do think that this is a strength of the film. However, I can understand how other people can watch the film and view this as a weakness. This is very much an experience and less of a personal narrative carrying you through the film. Now, if you want personal narratives, there are films like Thin Red Line and Saving Private Ryan to a certain extent. A lot of Vietnam War era films do this as well. But one thing that is common along with a lot of World War II films is they're usually more interested in the scope of things versus, these small interactions. Now, there's variance in that. But that being said, so I like the fact that this character, Tommy, was kind of a shit soldier. In the very beginning of the movie, you're not really sure what he's doing. I know he's like avoiding getting shot at and everything like that, but like he doesn't seem to know where to go. And like you can tell in his face and by his mannerisms that each moment he is experiencing more and more and more shock. However, I feel that the movie should have carried that through at the end and given some relief other than, a sense of heroism and all that kind of stuff, which kind of felt a little too jingoistic and not true to a soldier, winding down from such a horrific event.
Yeah, on that part, I definitely have to agree because I thought that kind of would have been where the movie headed to. But what ended up happening is at the very end of the movie, there's this ticking watch sound that keeps amping up, and that's prevalent throughout the whole film to really build up the sense of stress and anxiety, and you never know what's going to happen. And you hear that for like an expression of what he feels like inside. And that sound just stops. He falls asleep. The next morning, he reads a newspaper, and that's his entire storyline. That's a little ridiculous. And I think something that could have made it a lot stronger is if you had a moment kind of like the most recent episode of Rick and Morty where they get through their adventures and just break down. Everybody laughs at that scene because we all know, like, yeah, that's how you would react to something like that. But no, everything just stops and he's fine.
Now, I will say, based on some of the experiences that I've talked with people that were in the military at that time, yes, I have talked to World War II vets and I've talked to Vietnam vets, because one of the things that I have the honor of doing is actually meeting with veterans at some points, as a veteran myself. Granted, the things that I experienced are nowhere near what other people have experienced. I will say that given the series of events that happened in Dunkirk, I do find it shocking, and I can see your frustration with it, that people didn't break down. However, I will also say that the movie doesn't give that moment, like, because it's so constrained in, like, just shortly after the events happened. Usually what I've seen when people experience this kind of thing, and now civilians and military people are a little bit different in this, but like what I've seen in many cases is it takes time for people to break down. And granted, like the PTSD at that time, I believe it was called shell shock, that stuff would come later. And you could see that it was happening to some people at the moment. I think the movie could have done a better job emphasizing that. Could have spent a little bit more time with the characters. But I think that one of the strengths of the movie is the fact that the movie is begging you to be a character in the film. The way that it's shot, the way that things are experienced, like you are very much in the ride with them. This movie is more concerned with you understanding their experience than, recognizing individuals, because everybody's important. And I think to a certain extent that honors the people that fought, because that's not saying that, oh, this person was more important than this person. Oh, well, why didn't you focus on these 20 people over here? How do you do that? How do you focus on the right people? One thing that I will say that I was really thankful for in this movie was the fact that it didn't focus on the officers. So many goddamn war films focus on the officers and their experiences. Now, I understand the responsibility put on them to, command people. Part of the big issue with Dunkirk was, there was a complete lack of leadership. But I think that one real strength of the film is that you see people that aren't in a position of power, at least military power, to, understand or know how to, assess the situation. Pretty much the situation, like even if you were in a position of power, the trauma of seeing, ship after ship go down. It's amazing that these people were able to survive in these situations, because I'm sure there were many people that, unfortunately, the film didn't show, that that weren't able to get out of it and snap out of it in those situations. I think what you're probably asking for is there's a scene in Saving Private Ryan where a soldier, like right when they come to D-Day, one of the soldiers takes off his helmet because like he gets shot in his helmet. In a moment of shock, he takes off his helmet because he's like, holy shit, I got shot. And then he gets killed. Mm-hmm. I think that you're asking for those small moments. And I would agree with you that while I do think that this movie had a lot of strengths, I think that could have made the movie just a bit stronger.
Yeah, that's definitely what I was looking for in this movie, because I think that you're exactly right. The big strength of the movie is when it puts you in the film. Because if you were in that sort of situation, you wouldn't really know what to do. You wouldn't know the backstory and the personality of every person standing around you. You wouldn't know every person who died or who lived or who made it or what. And the film does a very good job of portraying the tension and the horror and tragedy of these sorts of events, with the ships going down, things being bombed, people, exactly like they say in the movie, lined up like fish in a barrel, just waiting to get killed and trying not to be killed for the whole movie. And the sound mixing with the score really does a good job of just making you feel anxious and tense the whole movie and just really building that up. And the cinematography is just in that sweet spot of being at the right place, at the right time, with the right amount of shakiness when it's needed, and the right amount of stillness when it's needed, and looking at what it needs to look at, and doing really interesting shots, but only when it works to service the story. The problem is that it's a big ensemble film with a lot of people in a lot of areas, in a lot of different events, who are all behaving very similarly. A little bit like watching a video game, where you can tell that they've all sort of been programmed a certain way. And It's not that they needed to sit them down and have them have long-winded expositions or that we really need to get to know them before it happened. Because I really like this new trend of movies that are based on history where it's not what happened before and then it's the thing and then it's what happened after. It just drops you in. Like, Selma did actually this exact same thing. It didn't have to establish, like, what his childhood was like or anything like that. It puts you at the moment. And I think that makes it a lot stronger because you can fully develop what is happening and really get involved with that whole experience. But with the exception of one character who is shell-shocked, you don't look around and see people behaving in a range of different ways. You see all these different people in all these different places behaving the same way all the time. And I think the problem is Christopher Nolan. I think this is a problem with the director not knowing the best way to direct his actors, because I think if you had a director like Barry Jenkins, who in Moonlight not only just made the three main actors feel fully fleshed out and developed, and like you really know them, even though they don't have a lot of dialogue and they don't have a lot of exposition, he made every single person, from the main characters to the secondary cast to extras in the background, feel like an actual person who you can see them and you can see that they are a fully developed character and not just words on a script. Because I think the script is really strong. I think that the writing is good and the dialogue is good, and with the somewhat nitpicky exception of the general on the dock and his whole overcoming his racism towards French people thing, that was super stupid and shoehorned in at the ending and really dumb. Except for that, I really think a lot of it came down to there's nobody to connect with. Civilians act like soldiers. Soldiers all act the same.
Well, to be fair, the civilians did volunteer to come out and rescue soldiers and sailors that had been lost at sea.
But they had no military training. 2 of them were children. They were underage. They were not even old enough to join the military if they wanted to. And the civilians really get to me because I really think acting-wise, the 3 of them were the worst in the film. They were just blanket expressions the whole time. Like, really bad. Which kills me because I like the fact that the civilians were incorporated into the story. I think that their writing was really well done, and I loved everything with the shell-shocked character and the way he interacted with them. With one small nitpicky exception. But in general, I really like that. But they don't emote. Ever. And they're civilians. There's no reason for them to not react to anything. And this is the one time I'm going to give spoilers. When one of them goes blind and dies, and none of them have any reaction, that's a really big emotional problem with your story. And you don't need to have them, like, break down and say no, or, like, have a lot of exposition or even a lot of talking. This is something where you need to have more time with every actor and get them to act differently from each other. And it's hard to do that, and I know Christopher Nolan is doing a lot of different things in this movie, but I honestly would much rather see the same script and the same team with somebody else working on it.
Now, I disagree with you a little bit on this circumstance. Now, I will say that it's definitely one of the weaker aspects of the film. I think the blonde kid, I don't know what his name was.
But he's the only blonde kid.
Yeah, but the blonde kid, his reactions were there, but he was also at the same time trying to do his job. There were a lot of facial expressions that he made to the captain of that boat, and there was a lot of regret and anger towards the guy with PTSD because he put that guy into a position. Yeah.
And I don't agree with that. For one, he was way too fast and quippy with the, well, you better bloody mind him, that whole thing. Was just like off the cuff, like he didn't just realize that his best friend was killed and dead.
Do we know that was his best friend? They just kind of worked together. I didn't see them like being on,
I assume that they must be like related or friends or something, because otherwise why would they be on the same boat? But it's not really established. You're right. But they're both children.
Well, you see,
and he wasn't even supposed to be there. Like, I don't know. I wouldn't think that a stranger would be able to just like hitch a ride and be like, I'll make myself useful. I really mean it, you guys. But my problem too is like what you're saying about how he's trying to do his job and just keep going. That is the reaction of everybody in this movie. Everybody is trying to do their job and just keep going. There aren't any moments where somebody freezes and dies because of it. There's no point where characters are, my friend just got killed and I'm not going to leave him, or like I'm in denial that he's dying or something like that. There's no point where people are like begging to survive, or they're like begging to get on a boat or to be on a little dinghy. There's no point where, in a lot of cases, there's some parts early in the movie where characters aren't even making some difficult work seem difficult or urgent work seem urgent. And it's not a problem in a case-by-case basis. It's a problem in an across-the-board between your main characters and extras that you don't see any range of reaction to an extraordinary situation. And I think that's a really big problem. It's one element, and I think it's one of the two elements that makes the movie not work very well for somebody who isn't as emotionally impacted by these events. But that's a big ongoing problem to have in your film. That's like one of the main proponents of what makes a movie work ever, like in any situation.
I will say that there is a certain extent of stoicism that's been beaten into these soldiers and sailors.
That's what I thought before the civilians were introduced.
There are circumstances where civilians do act that way, sometimes even more than soldiers. It's.
But how many times are you in a situation where everybody across the board behaves that same way?
Very rarely, but I can't say that it's outside of the realm of possibility. I mean, like, usually in the heat of the moment, people don't react very dramatically. Usually when it's prolonged, that's when you get a lot of these.
It was 3 days.
You can be on edge for 3 days. You can stay up for 3 days. You can be on edge
for 3 days, but it was 3 days by the time we, the audience, arrived and left.
Yeah, when I was in basic training, the first thing they did before we even started basic training was they kept us up for 3 days.
I understand that. I'm not saying it ruins the movie or makes the movie a bad movie, but I think that's a key proponent for why some people like this movie and some people don't like it.
I will say that given the fact that the movie is more of an experience than a dramatic piece, I would say that, especially with Tom Hardy's character, there definitely was something to be desired with the fighter pilots.
Although I think one of emotionally the best moments was with the other fighter pilot, not Tom Hardy, but the other guy, when he's trying to get out of his plane. I think that was one of the better performances in the whole movie.
Oh, yeah.
But what
the fear of that, like, if you're not afraid of drowning, this movie will definitely make you scared of drowning.
Yeah, absolutely. But I'm saying the events by themselves without the work of the actors is not enough to have a movie have highs and lows.
This movie has a lot of lows. It doesn't have a lot of highs.
One moment I do really like is actually the moment where I don't like everything around this moment, but I like the one specific moment where they have to cross the hole in the bridge with the guy on the stretcher, and everybody around them is cheering for them, even though they're fighting for, like, they're giving up their spot for this guy to go ahead.
Yeah, even though the whole situation was just a ploy that they came up with, which was something that I really liked, that they figured that out. Like, that was just like one thing. They were like, oh, we got to get on this ship. Well, they're transporting bodies and all that kind of stuff. So what are we going to do? Well, we don't have the armbands or anything like that, but we're just going to carry a body and fake it until we make it. I mean, obviously the horrifying aspect is once they get to the medical ship, it sinks. And then they proceed to see ship after ship sink in front of them, which I can't even imagine how horrifying that must be. There was another scene that I thought was especially tense, gripping, and horrifying was so they had left this boat, and because the boat was shot up, there was fuel all over the place. And there were soldiers that were trying to decide whether they wanted to drown or burn alive. And it was like kind of that in between because they were covered in oil. And like, man, I edge of my seat stuff. Like
that, I think, action-wise, was the best event in the movie. Pretty easily, I think, was the one with the oil.
There was that, but I don't know. For me, the whole stuff about going on to, I believe it was the destroyer at this time. I think it was a destroyer. It was a minesweeper at one point. When the ship went down, the first time when they were on the mess decks and they all had like toast and jam.
Oh yeah, that was. But also that was partly because like there was a little bit of a break in the movie.
Yeah,
that's really the only way that made that scene work.
Yeah, and it also made it a lot more tense because it's like, oh, you know, they don't have a lot to give them. They're giving them toast and jam because that's all they have at this point to give that many people. And then that experience of, you know, being within a closed space and, you know, having the water come in and everything like that. It's something that in my training, we had to experience something like that. I can't really go into too much detail about it, but that was something that that I did practice when I was training in the military.
Mm-hmm. One thing I did also really like about this movie was that in a way that worked exactly correctly and not at all the way they tried to emulate it in Hacksaw Ridge. The movie does a really good job of making it confusing who's on what side and who is a good guy or a bad guy.
Yeah, especially with Tom Hardy's character at first. Like, there was a period of time, like, at first where I was like, wait, is he part of the people gunning down these soldiers? Mm-hmm. You know, especially on the beach. That scene on the beach got me the most because they had all, like, huddled. And then when the plane comes and they look up and then it's just like everybody just like dives down. It's hard to explain why that's so tense unless you've been in circumstances where you are sort of a sitting duck. I mean, you can understand that like it's scary and all that kind of stuff, but like this is one of those things where like personally I feel for them. You know, and this is based on historical events as well. So, you know, which is not to say that the movie is somehow better because it's based on real events. I'm just saying that, like, I think that they conveyed that horrifying experience well. And along with the sound design, like every single one of these experiences, I mean, this is a movie that I am so glad that I watched in a theater because the sound design really truly makes it horrifying.
Yeah,
absolutely. Whereas like you will lose that if you watch it in a home setting. Mm-hmm. You know, just this. I mean, it's almost ear piercing. It's really well done.
Yeah, it's really good work. Absolutely.
Now for some of the more negative things that we had talked about, getting into the end a little bit, I think that one of the issues that I kind of had with the end was this movie was a roller coaster where you would expect people to throw up at the end, and we didn't get that moment.
Across any of the people. Like the whole, no, I'm gonna stick around and wait for the French now that it's kind of too late, was just obnoxious. That was even in there.
Yeah, I think that's one of those things where I don't know if that was the studio execs that stopped them because I do know, and this is the unfortunate things. This is one of the unfortunate things about making military films. Depending on whose help you get, you have to play by their rules.
That's true.
And especially for like American military films, like you can make a film that shows the military in a very bad way. You're not going to have the military helping you make that movie, which gets into the point where like they have final say on like edits and all that kind of stuff. Like it gets pretty crazy. Like they'll have a creative consultant with filmmakers the whole time. Possibly, they don't always. Particularly with stuff like stuff that doesn't involve historical stuff or that kind of thing. But I can see that it's very possible that Her Majesty's Navy and Her Majesty's Army did step in and lay some ground rules, especially at the end, like saying like, oh, you have to end it on this note and all that kind of stuff, which I think is not faithful and truthful to the actual people experiencing that. And I think that is a weakness of the film. I can't really forgive that weakness. But I will say that like the bulk of the film did not have that. And it's possible that those soldiers and sailors could experience that later, but given what we saw, not as much.
Mm-hmm. It was all very, let's just tie this up in a neat little bow and it's all over now. Forever. And it's like, no, it's not. And they did have the Churchill monologue that was talking about how, like, this isn't really a victory because this was, how do you say, an evacuation? Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an evacuation. It's not a war victory, whatever. But tonally, that's not what that ending was saying.
Yeah, tonally it was, the boys come back from war and, like, isn't it grand and all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And granted, that is an experience that has been seen at end of wars, after like the end of a conflict and stuff like that. Like World War I, one of the things that my grandfather told me was like he was around during like the end of World War I, really young. But he said that he was out and there were parties and parades and like people were just having a grand time. People were drinking all over the place and just, yeah. I mean, there was just a general good vibe when the war was over.
Yeah.
I think currently that's hard to even imagine because we're now at a point where wars don't end.
The other thing about this movie, too, that is one of those things that just makes it really difficult to engage with is the editing. And not the shot-to-shot editing, but the chronology of the editing.
Yeah, and this is something that Christopher Nolan is kind of notorious for.
And it works. In Memento, it doesn't work in Dunkirk, where you're there with a group of people one day, then you're there at night with another character, and then you're there the next day with another group of people, but then you go back to that first day, and then you go back to the night, and then you go back to the first day. And again, this is something you see at the end, where Tom Hardy is landing his plane chronologically, like as the rest of the scene plays out over the course of a day and a night and the next day. But obviously, in his scenes of him trying to land, it's just one evening. But in film time, it's a day and a half. A day and a night and a half a day.
I think what Christopher Nolan might be getting at is trying to embrace the recollection of these experiences and how, especially when you're dealt with so many traumatic events, how they can all just kind of blur together. Mm-hmm. So I could see that as one possibility for the reasoning behind that form of editing, narrative editing.
But it doesn't really work. It just makes a lot of the events really confusing, especially when you have footage that makes the action really confusing, because everything is well filmed. But, like, for example, at one point they're going east down the beach, and then they're going west down the beach. Where are they going? Which one is it? And it sucks because, like I said, the cinematography is excellent too. Perfect. I legitimately can't think of a movie this year that has better cinematography in America. But the editing really steps all over its toes.
Yeah, so that was our conversation of Dunkirk. Let us know in the comments what you think. All right, thanks for listening.